Have you ever had someone try to destroy you in front of everyone you know? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of public humiliation so heavy that you couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even imagine a tomorrow where you'd feel whole again? I have. And let me tell you, surviving that kind of deliberate cruelty, that calculated attempt to break your spirit in the most public way possible, changes you forever. But here's what he didn't expect. What he couldn't have predicted even in his wildest nightmares. I didn't just survive what he did to me. I came out stronger than he ever was. Stronger than he ever could be. Because while he was busy trying to crush me, I was learning something he would never understand. I was learning that true strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from rising up, even when everyone is watching you fall. My name doesn't matter. What matters is my story, because I know somewhere out there, someone is going through exactly what I went through. Someone is lying awake at 3 a.m, replaying that moment of public shame over and over in their mind, wondering if they'll ever feel normal again, wondering if the whispers will ever stop, wondering if they'll ever be able to look people in the eye without seeing pity or judgment. This is for you. This is for anyone who has ever been knocked down so hard that getting back up seemed impossible. This is for everyone who has ever been betrayed by someone they trusted, someone they loved, someone they believed would never hurt them like that. Because I lived it. I survived it. And I'm here to tell you that not only can you get through it, but you can come out on the other side better, stronger, and more powerful than you ever imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all started, to the moment when I first met him. Because understanding how I got to that point of public devastation requires understanding who he was, who I was, and how someone I once loved more than anything could become the person who tried to destroy me. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, one of those perfect autumn days where the air is crisp and the light hits everything just right, making the world look like it's been touched by magic. I remember because Tuesdays were always my favorite, always had been since I was a kid. There was something about the middle of the week, that sense of momentum building, possibilities stretching out ahead. I was at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and vintage furniture that doesn't quite match but somehow works perfectly together. I had my laptop open, working on a project that I was passionate about, completely absorbed in what I was doing, which is probably why I didn't notice him at first. He was standing at the counter, ordering something complicated, something with multiple modifiers that made the barista write it all down carefully. I noticed his voice first, deep and confident, the kind of voice that fills a room without trying, that makes people turn their heads and listen. When I finally looked up, he was walking toward the pickup area, and our eyes met for just a second. Just 1 second. But it was enough. You know how people talk about chemistry? About that instant connection that feels electric? I always thought that was something made up for movies, something that didn't really exist in real life. But I felt it. That spark, that moment of recognition. Like some part of me knew him even though we'd never met before. He smiled, a slow, confident smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and I found myself smiling back before I could think about it. That's how it started. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with a smile in a coffee shop on a perfect Tuesday afternoon. He introduced himself as Marcus, and we started talking, first about the coffee, then about the neighborhood, then about everything and nothing all at once. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, asking questions that made me feel interesting, making observations that made me laugh. Before I knew it, 2 hours had passed and my laptop was still open to the same page I'd been working on, completely forgotten. He asked for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation, without any of the usual careful consideration I normally applied to these situations. There was something about him that made me want to take a chance, to be spontaneous, to see where this unexpected connection might lead. That night, he texted me and we talked until 3 a.m, sharing stories and dreams and fears in the way you only can when you're just getting to know someone, when everything is still new and exciting and full of possibility. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a pattern. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates. Dinner dates turned into long walks through the city. Long walks turned into weekends spent together exploring museums and parks and hidden restaurants only locals knew about. He was attentive in ways I'd never experienced before, remembering small details I mentioned in passing, surprising me with my favorite flowers, sending good morning texts that made me smile before I even got out of bed. He integrated himself into my life smoothly, meeting my friends, coming to events that mattered to me, supporting my projects and goals with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. My friends loved him, of course they did, because he knew exactly how to be charming, how to make people feel special, how to create the impression of depth and authenticity. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs I missed then, the small red flags I overlooked because I was caught up in the romance of it all, in the intoxicating feeling of being chosen by someone who seemed so confident, so successful, so sure of himself. The way he would subtly correct me in front of others, framing it as helpful advice. The way he would make decisions about our plans without really consulting me, assuming I'd go along with whatever he wanted. The way his compliments often came with tiny barbs attached, disguised as jokes or constructive criticism. But I didn't see it then. Or maybe I saw it and chose to ignore it, rationalizing away the uncomfortable moments, telling myself I was being too sensitive, too critical, that relationships required compromise and understanding. He positioned himself as my mentor in many ways, someone who had more experience, more knowledge, more worldly wisdom than I did. And I let him, because part of me believed it, believed that he was helping me become better, that his feedback was making me stronger, smarter, more capable. I changed for him, slowly and incrementally, in ways I didn't fully recognize until much later. I started dressing differently, talking differently, even thinking differently, molding myself into the version of me he seemed to prefer, the version he praised and approved of. My own thoughts and opinions began to feel uncertain, filtered through the lens of what he might think, what he might say. 6 months into our relationship, he suggested we move in together. And even though something in my gut hesitated, I said yes, because saying no felt like admitting doubt, like acknowledging that maybe this wasn't as perfect as I wanted it to be. Moving in together accelerated everything, both the good and the bad, though at the time I was still focused on the good, still clinging to the belief that we were building something meaningful together. The apartment we chose was beautiful, a 2-bedroom loft in a trendy neighborhood with high ceilings and huge windows that flooded the space with natural light. I remember the first night we spent there, boxes still unpacked, sitting on the floor eating takeout pizza and talking about our future, making plans that felt solid and real. He talked about marriage, about children, about growing old together, painting pictures of a life that sounded perfect, that made me believe we were headed somewhere wonderful. But living together revealed aspects of his personality that dating hadn't fully exposed. Or maybe he had simply gotten comfortable enough to stop hiding them. The control intensified, disguised as care and concern. He wanted to know where I was going, who I was seeing, what time I'd be home, framing these questions as worry for my safety rather than what they actually were, attempts to monitor and manage my movements. He criticized my friends, pointing out their flaws and shortcomings, suggesting that I could do better, that I deserved people who were more successful, more ambitious, more like the friends he had. Gradually, subtly, I began seeing them less, making excuses about being busy, about having other plans, until the invitations slowed and eventually stopped coming altogether. My work, which had always been a source of pride and passion for me, became another target of his critique. He would review my projects with a critical eye, pointing out what he considered weaknesses or missed opportunities. His feedback always delivered with a condescending patience that made me feel small and incompetent. When I succeeded at something, when I landed a big client or completed a project I was proud of, his praise was lukewarm at best, tinged with suggestions for how I could have done even better. And when I struggled or failed at something, his disappointment was palpable, expressed through heavy sighs and comments about wasted potential. I started doubting myself in ways I never had before, second-guessing every decision, every creative choice, every professional move. The confident, capable person I had been when we met was slowly being eroded, replaced by someone anxious and uncertain, constantly seeking approval and validation from someone who withheld it as a means of control. Our arguments became more frequent, more intense, though they followed a predictable pattern. He would criticize something I'd done or said. I would try to defend myself or explain my perspective. He would escalate, accusing me of being defensive or unreasonable or too sensitive, until I found myself apologizing for things I wasn't even sure I'd done wrong, desperate to restore peace, to make him happy again. And then would come the reconciliation, sweet and intense, where he would hold me and tell me he loved me, and that he only pushed me because he saw so much potential in me, because he wanted me to be the best version of myself. I believed him every time, wanted to believe him, needed to believe that his harshness came from love rather than something darker. Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt like you were constantly walking on eggshells, never quite sure what might trigger the next conflict? Comment below if you have, because understanding that I wasn't alone in this experience was crucial to my healing. The isolation deepened month by month as my world shrank to accommodate his preferences and demands. I stopped pursuing hobbies he didn't approve of, stopped suggesting activities he wasn't interested in, stopped expressing opinions that contradicted his own. It was easier, less exhausting to simply agree, to go along, to mold myself into whatever shape would keep the peace and maintain his approval. My family noticed the changes in me, my mother especially, asking careful questions about whether I was happy, whether everything was okay, her eyes full of concern that I pretended not to see. I reassured them with practiced ease, painting a picture of domestic bliss that was becoming further and further from the truth, because admitting what was really happening felt like admitting failure, like acknowledging that I had made a terrible mistake in choosing him, in believing in us. The really insidious thing about this kind of relationship is how gradually it happens, how each individual incident seems manageable, explainable, survivable, until you look back and realize you've traveled miles from who you used to be, from the life you used to have, and you don't even remember all the steps that got you there. It's like standing in the ocean, not noticing the current pulling you further from shore until you look up and realize you can barely see the beach anymore. That's where I was, lost in the current, exhausted from fighting it, starting to wonder if maybe this was just what relationships were like, if maybe my expectations had been unrealistic, if maybe I needed to try harder to be better, to be enough for him. Then came the night that changed everything, the moment when subtle control and private criticism exploded into something much worse, something public and deliberate and designed to humiliate me in front of everyone I knew. It was a Friday evening in March, and we were attending a party thrown by a colleague of his, someone high up in his company, someone he'd been trying to impress for months. The party was at an upscale venue downtown, the kind of place with valet parking and a dress code, filled with successful people in expensive clothes, drinking expensive wine, and making connections that mattered for their careers. Marcus had been particular about my appearance that night, more so than usual, critiquing multiple outfit choices before finally approving a dress he'd bought for me the week before, something more conservative and understated than I would have chosen for myself. At the party, he was in his element, charming and charismatic, working the room with practiced ease, and I played my part as the supportive partner, smiling and nodding and making small talk with people whose names I'd forget by morning. Everything seemed fine, normal even by the standards of these corporate social events I'd learned to endure. I was talking with a small group of people, including his colleague's wife, about a project I was working on, something I was genuinely excited about. And for a moment, I forgot to monitor myself, forgot to filter my enthusiasm through the lens of what Marcus might think. I was just myself, the way I used to be before him, animated and passionate and fully present. I noticed him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable, but I didn't think much of it. Not then. The conversation continued, and someone asked me a question about my work, a thoughtful question that showed genuine interest, and I answered honestly, sharing not just what I was doing, but why it mattered to me, what I hoped to achieve with it. Others joined the conversation, asking follow-up questions, offering suggestions and encouragement, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months, the warmth of being seen and valued for who I actually was, not who I was pretending to be. That's when Marcus appeared at my side, his hand on my lower back, his grip just a little too tight, his smile just a little too fixed. He interrupted the conversation smoothly, his voice pleasant but firm, saying something about needing to steal me away for a moment. I excused myself from the group, thinking he wanted to introduce me to someone important, thinking this was just another part of the evening's performance. But he didn't lead me to another group of people. He led me to a relatively quiet corner, though still very much within view and earshot of most of the party, and his pleasant expression dropped away like a mask being removed. His voice was low but harsh, his words carefully chosen weapons designed to cut deep and precise. He told me I was embarrassing him, that I was talking too much, sharing too much, making myself the center of attention in a way that was inappropriate and attention-seeking. He said I was making him look bad, that his colleagues were probably wondering why he was with someone so desperate for validation, so obviously trying too hard. Each word landed like a physical blow, stunning me into silence, making my face burn with shame and confusion. I tried to defend myself, tried to explain that I was just having a conversation, that people had asked me questions and I was answering them, but he cut me off, his voice getting louder, attracting the attention of people nearby. He said I was being defensive again, proving his point, unable to accept constructive criticism without making excuses. He said this was exactly the problem, that I couldn't just listen and learn, that I always had to argue, always had to make everything about me. People were definitely watching now, conversations around us dying away as everyone's attention turned to our corner, to the uncomfortable scene playing out in front of them. I could feel their eyes on us, could sense the shift in the room's energy, the way people were trying to pretend they weren't watching while absolutely watching, the way they were exchanging glances with each other, silently communicating their shock and discomfort. My throat closed up, tears burning behind my eyes, but I fought them back, because crying would only make this worse, would only prove whatever point he was trying to make. He continued, his voice now loud enough that there was no pretending anyone nearby couldn't hear him, systematically dismantling me in front of all these people, these strangers and acquaintances and his professional colleagues. He brought up things I'd told him in private, vulnerabilities I'd shared in moments of intimacy, twisting them into evidence of my inadequacy, my neediness, my fundamental brokenness. He painted a picture of me as someone difficult to live with, someone who required constant management and patience, someone he had tried so hard to help, but who refused to improve, refused to grow up, refused to be better. It felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. Like surely this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not with everyone watching. But it was real, horrifyingly, painfully real. And it kept going, his words pouring out like poison, designed to hurt, designed to humiliate, designed to put me in my place and remind me of exactly where that place was. Beneath him, dependent on him, lucky to have him despite all my flaws and failures. When he finally stopped talking, the silence that followed was deafening, thick with tension and secondhand embarrassment. Everyone was staring now, not even pretending to do anything else, frozen in place by the awkwardness and cruelty of what they'd just witnessed. I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but feel the weight of all those eyes on me, judging me, pitying me, probably agreeing with everything he'd just said. Because why else would he say it? Because surely there must be some truth to his accusations if he was willing to air them so publicly. The tears I'd been fighting finally escaped, running hot down my cheeks. And I hated myself for that too, for giving him and everyone else the satisfaction of seeing me break. Someone tried to intervene, one of the women I'd been talking to earlier, saying something about how everyone should just take a breath and calm down. But Marcus shot her a look that made her step back, made it clear this wasn't open for outside involvement. He turned back to me, and for just a second, I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to my core. Satisfaction. He was enjoying this. This wasn't an angry outburst or a loss of control. This was calculated, deliberate, designed to achieve exactly what it was achieving. He was crushing me publicly, methodically, consciously, and he was enjoying watching me break under the weight of it. I don't remember leaving the party. Don't remember the walk to the car or the drive home, my mind mercifully shutting down to protect me from the full force of what had just happened. I know Marcus drove. I know we didn't speak. I know the silence in that car was heavy with things unsaid, and things that could never be unsaid. When we got back to the apartment, our apartment that suddenly felt like his apartment, like a space I was merely permitted to occupy, he didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what he'd done, didn't even seem to recognize that anything unusual had occurred. He got ready for bed with his normal routine, brushing his teeth and setting his alarm and climbing under the covers like it was any other Friday night, like he hadn't just eviscerated me in front of a room full of people. I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back at me. My makeup was smudged from crying, my eyes were red and swollen, but it was more than that. I looked hollow, defeated, like something essential had been scooped out of me and there was nothing left but the shell. I thought about calling someone, my mother or my best friend from college who I hadn't spoken to in months, but what would I even say? How would I explain what had happened? How would I make them understand that this wasn't the first time he'd been cruel, just the first time he'd done it so publicly? And underneath that, the shameful truth that I didn't want to admit to anyone, barely wanted to admit to myself, part of me wondered if he was right. Part of me wondered if I had been too loud, too attention-seeking, too embarrassing. Part of me had been conditioned so thoroughly over the past year to doubt myself, to accept his version of reality over my own perception, that even now, even after being humiliated like that, I was questioning whether maybe I deserved it. That's what this kind of relationship does to you. It rewires your brain, makes you question your own reality, makes you internalize the criticism and abuse until you become your own worst enemy, your own harshest critic, doing their work for them even when they're not around. I slept on the couch that night, telling myself it was because I didn't want to disturb him, but really it was because I couldn't bear to be near him, couldn't stand the thought of his proximity, his breath, his body in the same bed. I lay there in the dark, replaying the night over and over, each replay making me feel worse, smaller, more worthless. The weekend that followed was a special kind of torture. Marcus acted like nothing had happened, like Friday night was already forgotten, irrelevant, not worth discussing. He was cheerful even, making breakfast on Saturday morning, suggesting we go see a movie that afternoon, treating me with an affectionate casualness that felt like gaslighting. Like his refusal to acknowledge what he'd done was designed to make me question whether it had even happened the way I remembered. But I couldn't forget, couldn't move past it, couldn't pretend everything was normal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces at the party, all those people watching me be torn apart, judging me, probably talking about me right now, probably sharing the story of the dramatic scene they'd witnessed, probably laughing about it over their Sunday brunch. The shame was overwhelming, suffocating, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything else. I stopped eating, my stomach in constant knots, food tasting like ash in my mouth. I stopped sleeping properly, lying awake for hours, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I stopped leaving the apartment, making excuses about not feeling well, about having work to do, about just wanting a quiet weekend at home. The truth was, I couldn't face the world, couldn't imagine running into someone who'd been at that party, couldn't bear the thought of seeing pity or judgment, or worse, curiosity in their eyes. Monday came and I called in sick to work, something I never did, something that should have been a clear sign that I was not okay, that something was seriously wrong. Tuesday came and I did the same thing. Marcus expressed concern, but it felt performative, like he was going through the motions of being a caring partner without actually caring, without actually wanting to understand what was happening inside me. By Wednesday, I knew I couldn't keep hiding in the apartment forever, couldn't keep avoiding reality, but I also didn't know how to face it, how to walk back out into a world where people knew what had happened, where my humiliation was public knowledge. Have you ever felt so ashamed of something that you couldn't imagine showing your face in public again? Tell me in the comments. Because that isolation, that feeling of being fundamentally exposed and embarrassed, was one of the hardest parts of what came next. The whispers started almost immediately, filtering back to me through social media and mutual acquaintances who didn't know how much they were hurting me with their well-meaning check-ins. People had talked about the party, about the scene, about what Marcus had said, and how I'd just stood there taking it, crying but not defending myself, not fighting back. Some people expressed sympathy, saying it was inappropriate of him to air personal grievances so publicly, but others seemed to side with him, suggesting that there must have been something to his complaints if he felt strongly enough to address them that way. The narrative was getting away from me, being shaped and reshaped by people who didn't know the full story, who didn't understand the context, who were forming opinions based on a single dramatic moment rather than the slow deterioration of our relationship that had led to it. My phone buzzed constantly those first few days. Messages from people I hadn't heard from in months suddenly reaching out with questions thinly disguised as concern. People who wanted the gossip more than they wanted to help. People who saw my pain as entertainment. I stopped responding, stopped checking my messages, eventually turned my phone off completely because I couldn't deal with it. Couldn't handle the constant reminders of what had happened, of how publicly my failure and humiliation had been displayed. Marcus went to work every day like nothing was wrong, came home every evening and asked about my day with that same artificial concern, never once bringing up the party, never once apologizing, never once acknowledging that he had done anything that warranted an apology. His refusal to discuss it made me feel crazy, made me wonder if I was overreacting, if I was being too sensitive, if maybe I should just let it go and move on like he apparently had. But I couldn't let it go, couldn't move past it, because it wasn't just about that one night anymore. That night had been the culmination of everything, the public manifestation of the private cruelty that had been building for months, and seeing it displayed so openly, so unapologetically, had finally shattered the illusions I'd been maintaining about our relationship, about who he was, about who I had become. 2 weeks after the party, sitting alone in our apartment while he was at work, I finally let myself acknowledge the truth I'd been avoiding. The truth that was so obvious I couldn't believe it had taken me this long to see it clearly. This relationship was destroying me. He was destroying me, systematically and deliberately, piece by piece, moment by moment, criticism by criticism, until there would be nothing left of the person I used to be. And the worst part, the part that made me feel sickest, was that I had let him, had participated in my own destruction by staying, by making excuses, by accepting the unacceptable because leaving felt harder than staying. I looked around the apartment, at the furniture we'd chosen together, at the photos on the wall of us smiling at the camera, at all the physical evidence of a life we'd supposedly been building together, and I realized none of it was real. None of it was what I thought it was. It was all a facade, pretty on the surface, but rotten underneath, and I had been living in that rot, breathing it in, letting it poison me from the inside out. The decision crystallized in that moment, clear and sharp and absolutely certain. I had to leave. Not eventually, not after we tried couples counseling or had a serious talk or gave it one more chance. Now, immediately. Before he came home from work, before he could talk me out of it, before I could lose my nerve and convince myself to stay for one more day, one more week, one more month, I started packing with shaking hands and tears streaming down my face, throwing clothes into a suitcase without any organization, without any plan, just knowing I needed to get out, needed to get away, needed to put physical distance between me and this apartment and this relationship and this version of myself that I barely recognized anymore. I didn't have much, had accumulated surprisingly little in the time we'd lived together, and what I did have felt tainted, associated with memories I wanted to forget. I took only what I absolutely needed, what I couldn't live without, leaving behind everything else like I was leaving behind that whole chapter of my life. I called my mother, my voice breaking as soon as she answered, barely able to get the words out, and she didn't ask questions, didn't say I told you so, didn't do anything except tell me she was coming to get me, to pack my things and be ready, that I was coming home. The relief I felt at those words was overwhelming. The knowledge that I had somewhere to go, someone who would take me in without judgment, who would help me figure out what came next. I left a note for Marcus, short and simple, saying I was leaving, that I couldn't do this anymore, that I needed space to figure out who I was without him. I didn't explain everything, didn't detail all the reasons, didn't try to make him understand because I knew he wouldn't, knew he'd find a way to twist it, to make it my fault, to convince me I was making a mistake. I just left the note on the kitchen counter, grabbed my suitcase and my laptop bag, and walked out of that apartment without looking back, without second-guessing, without giving myself time to change my mind. My mother picked me up at the curb, and I climbed into her car and finally let myself fall apart completely, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, letting out all the pain and shame and anger and grief I'd been holding inside for so long. She drove in silence, one hand on the wheel and one hand holding mine, letting me cry, letting me break, knowing that sometimes that's exactly what someone needs. Permission to fall apart without having to explain or justify or hold it together. Going back to my childhood home felt like time traveling, like stepping back into a version of myself that existed before Marcus, before the relationship, before I learned what it felt like to be systematically broken down by someone who claimed to love you. My old room was exactly as I'd left it when I moved out years ago, frozen in time, a museum of my younger self, and I crawled into my old bed that first night and slept for 14 hours straight, my body finally relaxing enough to rest, knowing I was safe, knowing he couldn't reach me here. The days that followed were a blur of sleeping and crying and slowly, carefully beginning to process what had happened, what I'd been through, what I'd survived. My mother gave me space, but also made sure I ate, made sure I got out of bed, made sure I didn't completely disappear into my grief and shame. She didn't push me to talk about it until I was ready. And when I finally was ready, when the words finally started coming, she listened without interruption, without judgment, her face reflecting back the horror of what I was describing, validating my experience in a way I desperately needed. It helped to say it out loud, to hear myself describe the relationship objectively, to recognize through the telling of it just how abnormal it had been, how unacceptable, how abusive. That word, abuse, was hard to apply to my own situation, hard to accept that what I'd experienced qualified, because abuse was something that happened to other people, people in obviously bad relationships, people who stayed even when they were being obviously hurt. But my mother gently, firmly helped me understand that abuse doesn't always look like the extreme examples we see in movies, that control and manipulation and public humiliation are all forms of abuse, that emotional and psychological damage is just as real and just as serious as physical harm. Marcus called constantly at first, left voicemails that cycled through anger and confusion and false apology and threats and pleading, trying every tactic to get me to respond, to come back, to give him a chance to explain. I didn't answer, didn't listen to the voicemails after the first few, blocked his number eventually because hearing his voice was triggering, sent me right back to that place of fear and shame and self-doubt. He showed up at my mother's house twice, banging on the door, demanding to talk to me, yelling about how I was being unreasonable and childish and throwing away everything we'd built together. My mother called the police the second time, and after that, he stopped coming, though the calls and texts and emails continued from different numbers, different accounts, different methods of trying to reach me. Friends reached out, some genuinely concerned, some clearly fishing for information to share as gossip, some taking his side, telling me I was overreacting, that relationships take work, that I was giving up too easily. I learned quickly who my real friends were, who actually cared about me versus who just enjoyed the drama, and the list was shorter than I'd hoped, but also more solid, more dependable. The people who stood by me, who believed me, who supported me without question, became my lifeline, the foundation I would rebuild on. Therapy started 3 weeks after I left, with a counselor who specialized in trauma and abusive relationships, and those early sessions were brutal, forcing me to examine not just what Marcus had done to me, but what I'd allowed, why I'd stayed, what vulnerabilities he'd exploited, what patterns from my past had made me susceptible to his manipulation. It was painful work, uncomfortable work, but necessary work. And slowly, session by session, I began to understand myself better, began to untangle the knots of shame and self-blame that had kept me trapped. My therapist helped me understand that being targeted by someone like Marcus wasn't a personal failing, that manipulative people are skilled at identifying and exploiting empathetic, compassionate people who want to believe the best in others, who want to help, who want to love. She helped me see that the qualities that made me vulnerable to him, my openness and trust and willingness to work on myself, weren't flaws that needed to be eliminated, but strengths that needed to be protected, channeled toward people who deserved them. The shame began to lift, slowly, as I realized that what happened at that party wasn't my fault, wasn't something I deserved, wasn't proof of my inadequacy, but rather proof of his cruelty. The people at that party who witnessed my humiliation, their opinions didn't define me, didn't determine my worth, didn't have any bearing on who I actually was. I started working on reclaiming my identity, figuring out who I was separate from him, separate from the person I'd been pretending to be in that relationship. I started small, with tiny acts of self-determination that felt revolutionary after months of deferring to his preferences. I wore clothes I liked, watched shows I enjoyed, ate food I wanted, listened to music that moved me, all without having to consider anyone else's opinion or approval. I started writing again, something I'd abandoned early in our relationship because he'd made dismissive comments about it being a waste of time, and the words poured out of me like they'd been trapped inside, waiting for permission to exist. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I'd drifted away from, apologizing for my absence, for dropping out of their lives, and they welcomed me back with such grace and understanding that it made me cry, made me realize how much I'd missed them, how much I'd needed them. I started exercising not to change my body but to feel strong, to reclaim my physical presence in the world, to work out the anger and grief that lived in my muscles. I took long walks alone, relearning how to be comfortable in my own company, how to enjoy solitude without it feeling like loneliness. 3 months after leaving Marcus, I started looking for a new job, something that would take me in a different direction, away from the industry where we'd overlapped, where I might run into him or his colleagues or people who knew what had happened. The job search was harder than expected, my confidence still fragile, my self-doubt whispering that maybe I wasn't qualified, wasn't good enough, wasn't capable of succeeding on my own. But I pushed through it, applied for positions that excited me, interviewed even when I felt terrified, and eventually landed a role at a company that valued collaboration and creativity, that felt like the opposite of everything I'd experienced before. Starting over was harder than I'd anticipated, not just professionally, but in every aspect of my life. The shame still lingered, quieter now but persistent, showing up in unexpected moments when I'd catch myself about to apologize for nothing, about to shrink myself to avoid taking up too much space, about to defer to someone else's opinion when I had my own perfectly valid one. Unlearning the patterns that relationship had instilled was ongoing work, something I had to actively practice every single day, catching myself when I fell back into old habits, and consciously choosing different responses, different behaviors, different ways of being in the world. My new job became a source of unexpected healing, giving me a context where my ideas were valued, where my contributions mattered, where I could be successful without having to sacrifice my authenticity or dignity. My colleagues were supportive and respectful, and slowly I began to trust again, to open up, to allow myself to be seen without fear of judgment or criticism. The projects I worked on challenged me in ways that felt exciting rather than demoralizing, and I discovered skills and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, talents that had been suppressed during that relationship because they threatened his sense of superiority. 6 months after leaving Marcus, I took a solo trip to a place I'd always wanted to visit but he'd never been interested in, a small coastal town known for its art galleries and hiking trails. It was the first time I'd traveled alone in years, and I was nervous about it, worried about being lonely, about having too much time with my own thoughts, about not enjoying it without someone to share it with. But it ended up being transformative, giving me space to reflect on how far I'd come, how different I felt from the person who'd walked out of that party in tears. I spent my days exploring, hiking along cliff paths with stunning ocean views, visiting galleries and studios, talking to artists about their work and their creative processes. I spent my evenings at the small cottage I'd rented, cooking simple meals and reading books I'd been meaning to get to, watching the sunset from the porch and feeling genuinely content, genuinely at peace with myself in a way I hadn't felt in over a year. On the last night of that trip, sitting on the beach watching the stars come out, I had a realization that felt profound in its simplicity. I was happy. Not the performance of happiness I'd maintained during my relationship with Marcus, not the forced positivity I'd adopted to convince myself things were fine, but actual, genuine happiness rooted in being exactly who I was, exactly where I was, with no one to perform for, no one to please except myself. I cried. But this time they were tears of relief and gratitude and something close to joy. Tears for the journey I'd been on and the person I was becoming. When I returned home, I felt different, stronger, more grounded in my own sense of self. I started taking on bigger projects at work, volunteering for leadership opportunities, speaking up in meetings with ideas and perspectives I would have kept to myself before. My confidence grew with each small success, each moment of being heard and valued and respected. I was rebuilding not just my life, but my sense of my own worth, my understanding of what I deserved and what I would no longer tolerate. 8 months after leaving Marcus, I ran into someone from that party, the woman who'd tried to intervene during his tirade, and I braced myself for awkwardness, for pity, for some reference to that humiliating night. But instead, she pulled me aside and told me something I hadn't expected. She'd thought about that night many times since, felt guilty for not doing more, and wanted me to know that everyone there had been horrified by his behavior, that people had talked about it afterwards not as gossip, but as genuine concern for me, wondering if I was okay, hoping someone was checking on me. She said several people, herself included, had stopped associating with Marcus after that night, recognizing that anyone who would treat their partner like that wasn't someone they wanted in their lives. She told me I looked different now, lighter somehow, and she was glad to see it. That conversation changed something in me, shifted the narrative I'd been carrying about that night from one of personal shame to one of his failure, his cruelty being witnessed and condemned. The shame that had been weighing on me for months began to dissolve, replaced by something else. Anger. Not the hot, explosive anger that consumes and destroys, but a cold, clear anger that clarified everything, that made me see with perfect precision exactly what had happened and exactly why it was unacceptable. I was angry at Marcus, obviously, for what he'd done, for how he'd treated me, for the calculated cruelty of publicly humiliating me. But I was also angry at myself for staying as long as I did, for ignoring the warning signs, for allowing myself to be diminished. That anger, properly channeled, became fuel, became motivation, became the energy I needed to not just rebuild my life, but to build something better than what I'd had before. I started working with my therapist on deeper issues, the patterns and beliefs that had made me vulnerable to someone like Marcus, the ways I needed to strengthen my boundaries and trust my own perceptions. I worked on assertiveness training, learning how to say no without guilt, how to express my needs without apology, how to recognize and remove myself from situations and relationships that weren't serving me. I worked on forgiving myself, which was harder than forgiving him, letting go of the judgment and criticism I was directing inward, recognizing that I'd done the best I could with the understanding and resources I had at the time. 1 year after leaving Marcus, I was a completely different person, or maybe I was the person I'd always been underneath, finally free to exist without constraint or criticism. I'd been promoted at work, leading a team on a major project that was getting recognition within the industry. I'd reconnected with my creative passions, exhibiting some of my writing at a local arts showcase. I'd built a community of friends who supported and challenged me in healthy ways, Relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than control and performance. I'd learned to be alone without being lonely, to enjoy my own company, to find fulfillment in my own thoughts and activities. I'd started dating again, cautiously, carefully, with clear boundaries and heightened awareness of warning signs. And while I wasn't in a serious relationship, I was enjoying the process of meeting new people, of discovering what I wanted and needed from a partner, of recognizing that I didn't need to settle, didn't need to compromise my values or diminish myself to be loved. Then, exactly 13 months after walking out of that apartment, I saw him. It was completely unexpected, at a conference related to my field, one of those large professional gatherings with hundreds of attendees. I was presenting on a panel, discussing the project my team had been working on, fielding questions from the audience with confidence and expertise, feeling fully in my element. During the Q&A portion, I glanced up and there he was, standing near the back of the room, and for a split second my stomach dropped. My breath caught, all the old fear and shame threatening to rush back and overwhelm me. But then something else happened, something I didn't expect. I looked at him and felt nothing. Not fear, not anger, not sadness, just complete and utter indifference. He was just a person. Someone I used to know. Someone who used to have power over me but didn't anymore. Couldn't anymore because I wouldn't allow it. I finished answering the question I'd been asked. Continued with the panel. Didn't let his presence affect my performance at all. After the panel ended and people were approaching to continue conversations or ask follow-up questions, he made his way toward me, and I watched him approach with calm curiosity rather than dread, wondering what he wanted, what he would say after all this time. When he reached me, he opened his mouth to speak. But I spoke first, my voice steady and clear and completely unbothered. I said hello politely, the way you would greet any acquaintance, any former colleague, anyone you once knew but no longer have any connection to. He seemed thrown by that, by my calmness, my indifference, clearly expecting something different, some reaction he could manipulate or control. He started to say something about wanting to talk, about how good it was to see me, about how impressed he was by my presentation, and I could hear the manipulation in his tone, the attempt to flatter and charm his way back into some kind of relationship with me, even if just a conversation. I cut him off, not rudely, but firmly, and told him I appreciated the feedback on the presentation, but I had other people to talk to, other connections to make, and I didn't have time to catch up. The look on his face when I said that, when I dismissed him so casually, so completely, was almost comical. Shock, confusion, maybe even a hint of hurt. Emotions I recognized because I'd felt them myself so many times during our relationship, when he'd dismissed me, disregarded me, made it clear I was less important than whatever else he had going on. He tried one more time, saying something about how he'd thought about me, about us, about how he'd made mistakes and wanted a chance to apologize properly. And I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. Not the powerful, charismatic, successful man I'd once believed him to be, but someone small and insecure, someone who built himself up by tearing others down, someone whose cruelty came from his own deep-seated inadequacy. I told him I didn't need his apology, didn't want it actually, because his apology would be for him, to make him feel better, to alleviate his guilt, and I wasn't interested in helping him feel better about himself. I told him I'd moved on, built a life that didn't include him, didn't need him, didn't have any space for him, and I was happy with that life, genuinely happy in a way I'd never been with him. I told him I hoped he would work on himself, get help, figure out why he felt the need to control and diminish other people. But that wasn't my concern anymore, wasn't my responsibility, wasn't something I had any interest in being part of. And then I turned away, literally turned my back on him, and walked toward a group of colleagues who were waiting to continue our conversation. And I didn't look back, didn't wonder what he was thinking or feeling, didn't second-guess my words or worry about whether I'd been too harsh. I just walked away, free and unburdened, and engaged with people who valued and respected me, people who saw me as an equal and treated me accordingly. That moment, brief as it was, felt like the final piece of my healing, the definitive proof that I had not just survived what he'd done to me, but genuinely moved beyond it. He no longer had power over me, no longer occupied mental or emotional space, no longer defined any part of my identity or my story, except as a chapter that was firmly closed. I'd done more than survive his worst. I'd transformed it, used it as fuel for growth and change, emerged from it stronger and more authentic and more self-aware than I'd ever been. In the days following that conference, I reflected a lot on the journey I'd been on. From that night at the party, to this moment of complete indifference and freedom. The shame that had felt so overwhelming, so defining, so permanent, was gone, replaced by pride in my resilience, in my courage to leave, in my commitment to rebuilding myself. The humiliation he'd intended to crush me with had instead become the catalyst for the most important transformation of my life, forcing me to examine everything, to question everything, to rebuild from the ground up with intentionality and awareness. I thought about the version of myself who had stood in that corner at the party, crying while he systematically destroyed me in front of everyone, and I wished I could go back and tell her what I knew now, that this moment, as terrible as it was, wouldn't define her, that she would survive it and come out stronger, that the pain she was feeling wouldn't last forever, that she had more strength and capability than she could possibly imagine. I thought about all the moments in between, the hard work of therapy, the slow rebuilding of confidence, the practice of setting boundaries and trusting my own judgment, the courage it took to try again, to remain open to life and possibility despite having been hurt so badly. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been worth it, had been necessary, had led me to this place of genuine peace and self-acceptance. I started thinking about how to share this story, about whether my experience could help someone else who might be going through something similar, who might be trapped in a relationship like I was, who might be struggling to leave or to rebuild or to believe that things could get better. That's what led me here to sharing this with you, because I know how isolating it feels to go through something like this, how much it helps to hear from someone who's been there, who understands, who made it through to the other side. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're in a relationship where you're being controlled or manipulated or diminished, if you've been publicly humiliated or privately torn down by someone who claims to love you, I need you to know this. It's not your fault, you don't deserve it, and you can leave. I know leaving feels impossible. I know it's terrifying. I know it seems easier to stay and hope things will get better, but they won't get better. Not without you taking action. Not without you prioritizing yourself over the relationship. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness and dignity. Always. No exceptions, no matter what. You deserve to be with someone who builds you up rather than tears you down, who celebrates your successes rather than minimizing them, who supports your growth rather than trying to control it. And if you're not in that kind of relationship right now, it's okay to leave. It's okay to prioritize yourself. It's okay to choose your own well-being over someone else's feelings. If you've already left, if you're in the rebuilding phase like I was, I want you to know that what you're feeling is normal, that the shame and doubt and fear will lessen over time, that healing isn't linear, but it is possible. Keep going to therapy if you can. Keep reconnecting with people who genuinely care about you. Keep doing the small things that bring you joy and remind you of who you are outside of that relationship. Be patient with yourself, be kind to yourself, give yourself permission to fall apart and fall back together in whatever way and whatever time frame works for you. And if you've been on the other side of this, if you've witnessed someone being treated this way and didn't know how to help, let me tell you what would have helped me. Belief. Believe people when they tell you something's wrong, even if they can't articulate it perfectly, even if the relationship looks fine from the outside, even if you like the person who's doing the hurting. Believe them, support them, let them know you're there without judgment whenever they're ready to leave or talk or ask for help. The woman who spoke to me at that conference, who told me everyone had been horrified by Marcus's behavior, gave me a gift I didn't even know I needed. Validation that what happened was wrong, that it wasn't my fault, that people saw it for what it was. Understanding the content of this story, really understanding the dynamics of emotional abuse and manipulation, is crucial because it's often invisible from the outside, often denied or minimized by the people experiencing it, often dismissed by society as just relationship problems, rather than the serious harm it actually is. If this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your heart or reminded you of your own experiences or opened your eyes to dynamics you hadn't recognized before, please leave a like on this video. That like tells me this content matters, tells me there are others out there who need to hear these stories, who benefit from knowing they're not alone. Comment below and share your thoughts, your own experiences if you're comfortable, your questions or reflections or messages of support for others who might be going through this. This community, these comments, this connection between people who understand, can be incredibly powerful and healing. Subscribe to I Live to Tell for more stories like this. Real stories from real people who survived experiences that could have destroyed them, but instead made them stronger. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because you never know which one might be exactly what you need to hear at exactly the right moment. Thank you for listening to my story, for being here, for being part of this community. Remember that you're stronger than you know, braver than you think, and capable of surviving and thriving beyond whatever challenges you're facing. Your story isn't over, and neither is mine. We're still writing them, still growing, still becoming the people we were always meant to be, and that's something worth celebrating.